Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening, this is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. There are more than 60 serial murderers in Canadian history. For too long, awareness of serial murder in Canada has been confined to West Coast child killer Clifford Olson and the Schoolgirl Murderers, Bernardo and Karla Homolka, along with one of the most prolific serial killers in history, Robert Pickton. Unlike America, Canada has been viewed as a nation untouched by the shadow of serial murder. Then came Colonel Russell Williams and his bizarre homicides and serial home invasions, which were sensational news worldwide on the internet, television, and in newspapers and magazines. The reasons for Canada's serial killer blackout is clear. Until now, such information has never been compiled and presented in a single concise work. Cold North Killers is a wake-up call. This detailed and haunting account of Canada's worst monsters analyzes their crimes, childhoods, and inevitable downfalls. The book that was featured this evening is Cold North Killers, Canadian Serial Murder, with my special guest, journalist and author, Lee Mellor. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Lee Mellor.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Dan.
Thank you very much for coming on. This is very interesting. As you know, maybe the audience knows as well, I'm living in Winnipeg and born in Ontario, so this is even more interesting to me. Serial killers I had no idea about. So first off, a question that I often ask many of the authors is, what brought you to this idea of writing a book about Canada's serial killers? You've got at least 60 serial killers profiled in this book. What brought you to this project? What compelled you to want to do a book about Canada's worst monsters?
Well, originally I was going to write a fiction book, a series of detective stories, and I was going to have an RCMP profiler who went all over Canada solving these various murders. And I started thinking about the murderers that I was familiar with in Canada, the serial murderers, that is. And I could only come up with, like, Bernardo, Olson, and Pickton at the time. So I didn't want to duplicate something that had been done in real life, so I decided to do a little bit of digging. And what I unearthed so many interesting cases that I actually became more interested in writing a book on the nonfiction, the actual hidden story of serial murder in Canada, rather than my fictional mystery story.
Sure. Now, how did you start this? Because being in Canada myself too, not that I'm a serial killer expert, but I often have what can be considered serial killer experts on this program from America. You know, the really heart of true crime and people that are very experienced there, so that they can be considered experts. Now, where was your source of information, and were you surprised that you didn't know this, but were you surprised at the lack of information? And what were your sources of information to find out the list of serial killers in Canada and the information behind their crimes and their convictions?
Well, I started with the internet, which is, the perfect tool for searching. Sure. I went into newspaper archives, pretty much every major newspaper all over Canada, looked at some court documents, looked at books that had been written on some of the cases specifically, and even watched a few television programs just trying to glean all the information I could on it. As you probably know, our court system is much more closed than the U.S. as far as getting information goes, so sure. I was really scavenging.
We seem to have a technical difficulty. Let me see what's going on here.
Yeah, no problem.
There you go, Lee. We just lost you for about a few minutes, or a minute or so. So let's go back. You were talking about how Canadian system versus the American system, much more closed, and you were scavenging, you were really scrounging for information, and then we lost you in the signal.
That was pretty much it. I was a scavenger. I took any available sources I could. If I got lucky, I was able to get psychiatrist reports or court documents, things like that. But a lot of the time I was going through newspapers or the books that had been published, say, on some of these cases. A lot of the books are out of print, too, so I had to track them down. That was my main source. I wasn't able to speak with any of the killers or anything like that.
Well, you don't have room in if you're talking about 60 cases or 60 murderers with multiple, at least 3. So you're talking about a lot of murders. If you went through that, no one could put up. That's incredible. That would be, real manifesto. So what I found interesting for, again, we're talking to a world audience here, and a lot of people aren't so familiar with Clifford Olson. They must be familiar with Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka and Robert Pickton. And then there are some other interesting, Colonel Russell Williams, but we'll talk later in the program, if we've got a little bit of time, I think we will, just about the latest developments, how Canadians are really competing in this serial killer sweepstakes, or at least bizarre killer sweepstakes. Anyway, we're trying to get noticed. So let's go back and talk about the lesser-known serial killers in Canada that have a really... I found this fascinating just doing some of the research and looking through your book. Some of the very interesting cases that are unique, regardless of whether they're Canada or American. And tell us about Paul Jordan, or the alcohol killer. Let me see.
Gilbert Paul Jordan. Yeah, he had a number of aliases. I think he was Gilbert Paul L.C. He kept changing his name every time he came out of prison. But this guy started in Vancouver in the 60s. He was a kind of a geeky-looking guy, balding with glasses, and had absolutely no self-confidence, and had a number of child molestation and rape charges, I believe. His thing, aside from being a sexual predator, was that he was also a complete alcoholic and would often polish off, 40 ounces or 60 ounces of liquor in a day. So he kind of combined the two into this really bizarre signature where he would get the sex workers from Vancouver's infamous downtown area, and he would take them to hotels or back to his barber shop, and he would play drinking games with them, which he would always win because he had kind of an iron liver by that point. And then when they passed out unconscious, he would pour the rest of the contents down their throats, and they would die of alcohol poisoning, and then he would rape them as they were dying, and I imagine probably was still raping them after they were dead. So it's probably one of the most unique signatures that a serial killer has ever employed, and it also had the handy side effect of being able to pass off your victims as just alcohol overdoses.
There was some controversy in court, though, because, again, he got 8 to 10 women died by this way. So by the time people had heard about this, there was some controversy in court as to whether they could ever prove that what he was doing was actually murder that you're speaking about. Tell us just a little bit about that, because there's a little bit about that this guy was known for a little while. And then finally, tell us how he was actually convicted and what was his inevitable fate himself.
Oh, well, I can tell you it was an inevitable fate right off the bat, and it's quite startling, actually. We have the dangerous offender law in Canada, where if you're somebody that's convicted of multiple heinous crimes, you can get this designation where you're not allowed to be let out of prison. But amazingly, they kept, even after he was convicted of these serial murders, they kept letting him out of prison, and he'd reoffend again, not necessarily with a murder, but with breaching, his parole, or just as minor crimes or sex crimes. Right. And so essentially, he kept offending until the day he eventually died, and they never really figured out that they should just keep him in prison. It's strange to me.
Yeah, well, there was, again, I think the controversy was that there was, I mean, it's a hard thing to prove that what he did other than people willingly drinking alcohol together. So unless you have this reliable eyewitness, and we won't bore the American audience or world audience with what's wrong with Canada in terms of regarding intoxication as a major excuse for murder, but, our friends across the border don't have a similar device where alcohol actually can diminish murder or reduce murder to something like manslaughter. So, and I'm not sure about every other country, but I'm pretty sure that there are few countries, if any, have that same sort of, as you know by reading, being a student of the media, that it's almost routine to drop murder to manslaughter because of intoxication. So.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I mean that. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that could have been a factor. There's just some things that are interesting to me. For instance, that when they did an autopsy on one of the victims, Ivy Rose Oswald, they found that she had a blood alcohol level of 0.51, and death by alcohol poisoning normally occurs at 0.4. So, to me, that's very suspicious. How does she keep drinking after she would be dead? Plus, they also had audio recordings of him saying strange things to them, like, "Come on, one more drink, baby, down the hatch." Basically egging them on to drink themselves into unconsciousness. So to me, there was a lot of proof.
Yeah, see, the thing is that's what again, an American audience might find odd that you just said this guy committed 8 to 10 murders, and yet he was not in prison for the rest of his life. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are devices in other countries where this negligent behavior, regardless, someone dies, then that someone has to be responsible, and the sentences are much stiffer. So there wouldn't be a serial killer like this in other countries, I would think, and certainly, definitely, as far as my research is, not a chance in America. Now, tell us about some other notorious murderers in Canada. And you just name some, and then we'll discuss those. Okay.
Well, you said you're from Winnipeg. Mm-hmm. Let's start with Michael Vecchio. Are you aware of him?
A little bit, but tell us more about Michael Vecchio and what you found out.
Okay, well, let's go back to what you said before about the definition of a serial killer being 3 victims. Actually, after a conference by the FBI and various academic experts on the subject in San Antonio, they decided to drop it to 2 now. So that it's only 2, and there is a lot of controversy over that. So my book does feature a lot of offenders that have only been convicted of 2, but at the same time, it was, a reasonable assumption they'd offend again. And one of them is Michael Vecchio. He was in Winnipeg. He was right after World War II, and basically someone was raping these or sexually assaulting these boys in their early teens or children at gunpoint in Winnipeg. And whenever they refused him, he would shoot them, and so he ended up killing 2 boys. And they actually caught him by finding him in Thunder Bay after he'd robbed a bank, and they linked the weapon through ballistics to the Winnipeg murders, and that's how Michael Vecchio was brought to justice.
Wow. Well, that's fascinating too, because that's my hometown, Thunder Bay. So, yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I grew up with a guy named Vecchio, so the Vecchio family would be familiar with me too. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, it could be related.
Now, what was the fate of Michael Vecchio? He was convicted of the 2 murders, obviously.
No, he ended up at the end of a hangman's rope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, swift justice.
Yeah, they didn't mess around back in those days. You had a couple months.
Yeah. Now, tell us about maybe someone from another part of the country, so we can get a little geographical idea that it's not just West Coast. Tell us about some other serial killers not known to the general public.
Okay, well, there's probably Toronto's most interesting serial murderer was a 17-year-old boy by the name of Peter Woodcock, and he was operating in the late 1956 and early 1957. He was highly mobile, but he rode a bicycle around Toronto, and essentially he would lure these little children into parts of Toronto like ravines or down to Cherry Beach, which was then quite deserted, and he'd choke them and beat them, bite them, and just kind of strangle and suffocate them into death. These very sort of spontaneous hand crimes to kill these children. And there was also a really immature sexual element to them too, like he would undress them, look at the bodies, and then redress them, but without actually sexually assaulting them. And the first two victims were young boys, like around 9 years old. The third victim was a girl, I believe she was about 4, and he killed her by thrusting a branch into her vagina. So they finally catch this weird kid with glasses who's riding all over Toronto and acting quite suspiciously, and they put him in a mental hospital, and he stays there from 1957 to 1991, when they finally decide that he's been through enough rehabilitation that they can allow him out on a day pass. And you know what? He doesn't even get off the hospital grounds. As soon as he's out of the hospital, he murders a fellow patient, Dennis Kerr, sodomizes his corpse, and then walks to the police station and turns himself in.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, it's hard to beat something like that. Incredible. Now, what about Wayne Bowden?
Wayne Bowden. Okay, so now we're moving into Quebec. Wayne Bowden was known as the Vampire Rapist or Strangler Bill, and he kind of surfaced in 1969. Bowden's signature, which is the kind of like a psychosexual expression, which we use to link crimes, was biting into the breasts of his victims, hence the term the Vampire Rapist. So in 1969, 1970, that era, he killed 3 women in Montreal. He'd go back to their apartments with them, and then he'd sexually attack them and bite their breasts on 2 of those occasions. And the whole city was in a panic looking for this guy, and then it stopped. But he resurfaces in Calgary, Alberta, and he murders a woman there, and they're able to link him to that crime through the bite marks. So it was actually the first time that I believe bite mark evidence was used in North America to convict any kind of offender, and it's important because later it would be used, to apprehend Ted Bundy, but it started in Canada.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, that's a very interesting twist. Now, what about William Patrick Fife? And you say he's been convicted of 5 murders in Montreal, but he's a suspect in many more. Tell us a little bit about William Fife.
Well, the last number I think they pegged him at was 9. William Fife was known as the killer handyman. His first murder, they believe, was 1979. And he wasn't apprehended till 1999, so he was killing over a 20-year period. Right. His modus operandi was basically he would stalk these women that were living on their own of various ages, and when he was certain that they weren't living with a man or that a man wasn't going to be home, he would often go and knock on the doors and say, well, the landlord sent me around to fix the sink or something like that, like a ruse approach. Once he'd gain entry to the house, he'd attack the women, often raping them, and he was a lot of anger in that man. He would stab his victims 44 times, bludgeon them, beat them severely. And then towards the end of of his career as a serial killer, he was actually torturing them to get their ATM codes. So the police got the first look at him when he was caught on an ATM camera accessing one of the women's bank accounts. He was eventually caught by DNA. He was already on record, and he left some DNA at one of the crime scenes, and so that was that. And they threw him in jail, and eventually he confessed to these other murders going back to 1979, which they hadn't linked him to.
So he's got 9. He's 9 under his belt then.
Yeah, that's a pretty safe bet.
Mm-hmm. Now, we talked about Peter Woodcock. Tell us about another interesting serial killer that people might not have heard about.
One that people might not have heard about. Okay, well, there's so many of them. There is a guy called Ronald Glen West. He was known as the 22 caliber killer. Lots of serial killers have had that moniker over history, but he was actually the first. And he was a policeman in Toronto, and he would drive to the sort of countryside just north of Toronto, and he would knock on the doors of housewives while their husbands were away. Then we're not quite sure how he gained entry to the house. He might have pulled a gun. He might have tricked his way in. But once inside, he would rape them at gunpoint, and then he'd shoot them to death, often in front of their children. And because he was a policeman, he was very forensically aware, so he would collect a lot of the evidence and shell casings. So he committed these 2 of these murders in 1970, and then the trail just went cold, and it was cold for 25 years. And then they actually catch him in Thunder Bay committing an armed robbery. And they, just through good police work, the guy who caught him for the armed robbery was at an OPP conference with a guy who was investigating this cold case from 1970, and he mentioned this specific type of gun that Ronald West used, this pistol. And the guy, the police officer investigating the 1970 murders, he realized that it was the same rare type of gun that they were looking for. So they eventually linked West to those rape murders by a DNA sample.
Interesting. Another unique case. How about, tell us about Leopold Dion.
Oh, Leopold Dion, okay. So that's back in the 60s. He was known as the monster of Pont Rouge, if that memory serves me correctly.
That's right.
Basically, he was a child killer, and he worked around the Quebec City area, so Quebec's capital. And what he would do is, once again, he would use this ruse that we've seen with William Fife, that Ron West might have used. It's essentially a way of approaching a victim. And his ruse was to approach these kids and say, would you like me to take photographs of you to be in this magazine? I'm a photographer. And I guess that those being more innocent times, the kids would go with him, and he'd take some pictures of them, and then he'd put them at ease. And then, can I just drive you out to the country and take some pictures there? And once they'd agree, and once he had them out in the country, he'd strangle them he had like a studded garrote that he had made, and he'd strangle them with that and then bury the bodies. And he was eventually identified because he approached a number of kids that didn't go with him, and one of them picked him out from a group of photographs that police officers had of sex offenders in the area. So Leopold Dion was brought to justice in that way. And the interesting thing about him actually was he had a kind of Jeffrey Dahmer type death in that he went to prison and he was originally supposed to hang, but as he was in prison, a psychotic inmate who thought that he was Lawrence of Arabia, he killed Leopold Dion, and that guy's name was Norman Champagne. And I found out actually after I wrote Cold North Killers that Champagne was in prison for killing somebody too. So technically under the new classifications, that would make him a serial killer. So the serial killer Leopold Dion was killed by another serial killer, Norman Champagne, who I guess happened to be a little tougher than he was, or more psycho, or
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, very interesting. How about Edward B. Is it Bulloff or Roloff? Edward Roloff.
Oh, Edward Roloff. Yes, he was Canada's first serial killer, and he actually committed all of his crimes in the United States. But Roloff was born in New Brunswick and raised there, and he was an absolute genius of a man. In fact, they've still got his brain in some university somewhere, and apparently it weighs. It's one of the densest brains as far as weight goes in the world. And Roloff was kind of one of those 19th century serial killers that preyed a lot on his family. He was a very jealous man and domineering. So when he moved to the United States, it was to New York, and he took a wife there, who he beat regularly. The rest of the family didn't like Roloff for this reason. So Roloff decides to get even. He passes himself off as a doctor. So when the wife and child of one of his wife's brothers got sick, they asked him to go and tend to her. He poisons her and the child to death. He then kills his own wife and child, and he makes off with their bodies, and he's jailed for that. He escapes from jail and goes back to New York and attempts to join some kind of criminal ring where he's the leader, and he's got these underlings under him. They rob a shop, and they shoot a clerk dead in the process. And then so that his accomplices won't tell on him or take his cut of the loot, he kills both of his accomplices. So there wasn't really the sexual component to his crimes that we've seen with the other ones. He was more motivated by just his ego, his jealousy, and his desire for material comforts, and to see himself as an ingenious criminal, which he wasn't actually. He was a rather poor criminal. If he would have stuck to his strengths, which was in languages, etc., he probably would have done a lot better in life.
Yeah, serial killing probably doesn't pay that well.
No, well, yeah. It's amazing that you bring him up because him being so known for his intelligence, yet being such a dismal success as a serial killer, he's completely incompetent. Yet then we get someone on the West Coast like Robert Pickton, who has an 87 IQ and looks just like a serial killer. That runs a big farm. All signs are going, that this is a guy that should be caught right away. Well, he's killed from 31 to 49 plus women. So one of the interesting things I noted while researching serial killers is that IQ doesn't necessarily equate to success in this. And for your American listeners, consider guys like Gary Ridgway, who had an 82 IQ, but he was 48 women. I think he holds the current record in the United States.
Yeah, and then the thing is, you get a person like Ted Bundy, he was an intelligent guy. He was politically involved. He could have been a lawyer, and he could have been a politician, or he could have been very seriously politically involved. He was charismatic. But then again, we'll talk about this a little after we go through a few more murderers. But some of these people, it overcomes them. Their narcissism overcomes them. Their need for infamy, the dark side overcomes them in terms of any kind of control. And a lot of these guys go from being a little bit more calculated to getting not so calculated, or so in a downward spiral. Mm-hmm. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. Tell us about another kind of unique killer in Canada. Just name another one in your book, and let's talk about them.
Okay, well, we got another guy in Montreal called Angelo Cololillo. He was never actually convicted because he hung himself before his trial, but unfortunately that doesn't get you out of my book, those tactics. So Cololillo, they actually caught him. He was already had convictions as a rapist, but they caught him because I guess while he was inside prison, he made friends with a guy called Nick Paccioni, who was also of the same kind of sadistic bent. And when Kolololo got out of prison, he was murdering these he murdered a 20-year-old and a 12-year-old girl, but he did it in a way that was extremely organized, and he covered it up by lighting fires. I believe he'd get into the house, rape them, torture them, strangle them to death with a folded towel, which he called the Mr. Spock method. And we only know this about him because he wrote about it in letters to Paccioni in prison, but he disguised it. He didn't say, I did it. He said, imagine there was this character called Bob who did this. And then as the prison officials were intercepting these letters, they realized that he was speaking about actual murders that were unsolved, or in some cases, things that had been deemed accidents. So when he killed his third victim, Jessica Grimard, who was 14, he dragged her into the woods and stabbed her to death and raped her. He sent a letter to Paccioni, and this is the one that they intercepted and tipped him off, and they linked them back through his letters to these previous murders. So he's an interesting serial killer in that he managed to commit two murders that one of them was deemed an accident and one was a suicide. So incredibly organized. Kind of relating back to what you said about Bundy a second ago, he would have got away with it if he didn't need to brag about it. But it's like he couldn't keep his mouth shut. He had to tell someone. His narcissism got the better of him, and it often does with these guys. That's what trips them up.
Yeah, well, sometimes it trips them up, but we'll talk about this a little bit later on. It's a little bit different when you look at a guy like Twitchell, the guy I was involved with, Sidney Tierhus, and you look at Luca Magnotta, and you start looking at, well, wow, it's different. I think there is some evolution because we're looking at the better-known cases, the 60s, the 70s, even the turn of the century had some savages and some really diabolical killers. So there is no reason to think that, based on what's going on in popular society, and Luca Magnotta is very much a reflection of that, is that there is something else going on, I think, in you see the front page of the Winnipeg Sun today. Kid, 18 years old, involved in serious torture and home invasion, talking about his allegiance to Lucifer and his serial killer aspirations. So, yeah, there's something going on anyway.
Yeah, you can bet too. Just to clear something up, this whole idea that there are these satanic cults murdering people, it really is a myth. This allegiance to Lucifer is probably he probably has no understanding of Satanism, might not even fully believe in it, or just be completely whacked out on some kind of really hard drug or schizophrenic or something. But that, I imagine, kind of like Richard Ramirez, I think it's a big part of his image. You know, he knows that by saying, I'm allied with Lucifer, that it's going to make headlines, which it did. We're talking about it right now. You know, these guys look for angles. Luca Magnotta, I think he was all about that. He was looking for as many angles as he possibly could. Like, did we actually see him eat that piece of flesh that he cut out of the guy's buttocks? We didn't. He placed it on a fork and showed it to the camera. You know, he's got a kitten in there, just to show us how depraved he is, or he wants us to think he is. So yeah, there's certainly this kind of generation coming up of serial killers that are out to impress us, or just general murderers that are out to impress us with their depravity. And I think that would be a reflection of this cult of celebrity kind of civilization that we live in right now, where it's better to be infamous or famous for something terrible than to be a nobody. You know, to not exist in the media eye is like the worst possible fate that we can imagine in our modern age.
Yeah, and it really, I mean, it's not a new phenomenon. I say, well, it's an evolution, but really it's just Canada's just a little bit behind America, it seems, you know. We're definitely affected by their culture. So Richard Ramirez doing the Satan thing, or Charles Manson doing the Nazi thing, again, aligning yourself with Hitler is pretty good, too, to get to, upset mom and dad, So the thing is, Richard Ramirez, it used it to his advantage. He got married. He had all kinds of women proposing to him and pledging allegiance to him. And really, it's just like these guys are just like rock stars, and their trials are just their big moment on stage, and they'll be remembered, and they'll live on in infamy forever because of the books and the photos. And so really, their wish really does come true. And some people have a little bit of a problem with that. But what I think is now is that because there are the Gary Ridgways and the Robert Picktons where they've got 49 or 48, well, you know what, these guys are in a rush to get famous, so they're going to have to one-up each other by trying to do as much multimedia as possible and as shocking as absolutely possible. Yeah. And, you know, that's why I see Twitchell, Tierhuse, and Magnotta and Colonel Williams all sort of influencing each other, because really a lot of these stories don't play that far or that deep into the U.S. They have a lot of their own serial killers and all kinds of breaking, interesting, and bizarre news that they're not likely to cover that much from Canada, except the bigger, high-profile cases. Mm-hmm. But I think what we have is a one-upping each other, and I think that is especially prevalent in the last few years in Canada. It just seems odd.
Yeah, definitely. There was a guy caught in Toronto recently. It was after my book was published, called Mark Moore, and he had these delusions that he was like this gangster rapper and that he was, part of a posse and going around killing people. But he was just by himself. He was a total loner, just driving around shooting people with a handgun from his car window. It's once again a reflection of the whole celebrity thing. And I think what's interesting is that these murderers that we're talking about, like Magnotta and Moore and Twitchell, who are motivated by fame, is they tend to not kill very many people before they're caught. They're caught almost immediately because they're just screaming out for attention. Where if you look at guys like Robert Pickton and Gary Ridgway, they didn't really want us to know what they were doing. They weren't big into the thought of being known as serial killers. I mean, in fact, Pickton still hasn't even admitted to it. And Ridgway talks about it, but he's somewhat reluctant to. And you can tell that it was not his point to be a star. These were guys motivated by deep-seated inferiority and rage. And for that reason, they kept it very much under wraps. They weren't trying to be in the public eye. Maybe they wanted the image of the Green River Killer. Ridgway wanted this whole Green River Killer to be in the public eye. He might have got some satisfaction from that, but I don't think he ever wanted the name Gary Ridgway linked to it. And because of that reason, I think the more egotistical and the more you use it as a vehicle for fame, the less likely you are to actually become a serial killer. In fact, like Magnotta, you'll probably kill one person and get caught.
Well, I don't, all I know is the case that I was involved with, and the killer posed the question which serial killer that he most closely resembled. And when I first looked at the case, and when I obviously went real deep into research for the book, trying to get the book deal, but also just trying to get as much background. And I interviewed the killer for a year, and in that year, I learned as much as I could from the authorities, the authors that have interviewed these people, that have had the opportunities to interview these people. And then, of course, guys like Douglas and Ressler, who created the criminal profiles by interviewing 36 of the worst serial killers. And you sort of get, not that you're an expert after that, but you sort of get an idea of the serial killer mind. And it makes no sense for the guy that I was involved with. That's why I consider him a serial killer, for him to have, that this was his last crime, because, and we won't go into it, but certainly that it makes more sense that this was his last crime. And when he had a spectacular opportunity, having Susan Sarandon's stolen gold necklace, he knew that this would set off the paparazzi that were in town, because Jennifer Lopez was going to be in town within a day or two. And so I think that's what his motivation was. So I think there's also a phenomena in Canada, too, where this guy, at least that I was involved with, wanted to have his cake and eat it, too. Do a few years in jail because he knew that there was a good chance, if you said, I'm drunk and I can't remember, that this intoxication would mean that he could have everything. He could have fame, a little stint in jail where he would be a celebrity in his mind, and then freedom, and still having all his incredible memories of the people that he did kill. So that's just my suspicion and my take on it from everything that I've researched. But I think some of the people that are arrested in Canada, that there isn't an immediate response by bringing in FBI-trained criminal profilers to interview those people effectively.
No, a lot of it is done by psychiatrists or psychologists in the prison, and it's funny because they still think that they can rehabilitate some of these people. A colleague of mine, Dr. Eric Hickey in the U.S., he's a very well-respected expert on serial murderers. He came all the way to Kingston to interview Clifford Olson, and they told him in Kingston when he got there that he couldn't interview Olson because they thought it might disrupt Olson's rehabilitation process. And it's just a complete disconnect from reality. You do not rehabilitate Clifford Olson. This is a guy who's calling the parents of the kids he's murdered from prison and describing to them what he did to them. This is a guy who was able to get Dr. Hickey's home phone number. He's a master manipulator. He was, even before he was a serial killer, he was a terrible criminal. He was a rapist, breaking into houses, a complete and utter psychopath. And it baffles me that the Canadian mental health will look at someone like Clifford Olson and say, yeah, we've got to cure him. Why? Why would you cure him? So that he can be cured and in prison? Because if you're thinking of letting him out, you probably shouldn't have your license to practice mental health.
Well, the thing is, Clifford Olson, I don't think was by definition insane, but we have and I won't bore the audience but we have our unique case of Vincent Lee, now out on day passes after 3 years after the bus beheading on the Greyhound, and it looks like he's going to be a sort of a poster boy for psychiatric rehabilitation in terms of if this guy can. They're talking about his incredible cure from schizophrenia under medication. They wish all of their mentally ill patients would respond in such an effective, in such a profound way. And so you can already see, they've already spoken about it. Within 5 years, this person will be free based on they rehabilitated him with a drug. And I think our American neighbors and other people in the world, and that's why I think it's an interesting case, and I think that's why true crime in Canada is just getting more and more interesting. When this stuff goes to court in America, a lot of states are still death penalty. There definitely is, most states have a device of parole without any possibility, life sentence without any possibility of parole. Here, it's not a foregone conclusion. We have the doctor that stabbed his kids to death, and it's amazing, and it seems to be more, as precedent shows, more and more that we're excusing murder. And like you say, we still think we can rehabilitate killers, and we routinely let them out before their life sentences on parole to see their safety, how safe they can be in the public, and then we routinely let them out. So very scary.
In fact, I have a whole chapter. I think it's the last chapter of the book devoted to that, just where the system has made errors in judgment in bailing out, letting dangerous offenders out of prison. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to write the book, because I thought that the true story of the history of serial murder in Canada hadn't been told, and to give people 60 cases to look at and to say, how do you think things are functioning here? That was a big part of it. But also, I'd like to get back to this idea of them saying that Vince Lee is cured, and then also doing mental health work on someone like a Clifford Olson or a Paul Bernardo. Comparing Vince Lee to one of those guys, it's like comparing a banana to a grapefruit. I mean, the guy killed because he was extremely psychotic, and when I use the word psychotic, I mean it in its proper sense, that he was schizophrenic. He was literally probably having the equivalent of a massive acid trip. Like, he was completely flipping out, hallucinating. His whole sense of reality was distorted. So he's not killing out of vindictiveness. He's killing because it's like being in a nightmare, and he wants to escape it.
Oh,
and
sure.
That is, yeah, and that's definitely, yeah, they can control it with medication. I don't think that they should be letting him out so soon, definitely. And because if he stops taking the pills, which a lot of paranoid schizophrenics do because they think the pills are the problem, then he can easily go back into that headspace. But, I mean, when you look at someone like that, yeah, you might be able to rehabilitate somebody who's killing just because they're psychotic. But there's a difference between psychotic and psychopathic.
Oh, absolutely.
And everyone knows you cannot rehabilitate a psychopath. It's just basic criminology 101. And so this is what made me laugh about the Olson. Oh, we're working on his rehabilitation. It's like, what school did you graduate from?
Well, I think it's horrible, even though it's just an exercise, really, with Robert Pickton, that he has a parole date. The families will gather together. They will be anxious while he has a parole date, which I just don't understand why you can't have consecutive sentencing and get it over.
No, I agree with you. I'm in complete agreement. It's almost like he's doing the same time as he would for killing one or two people. There's no difference really. I think that in fact, I mean, this dangerous offender law, we use it for people who are likely to commit brutal crimes but haven't actually killed. That's when it's usually used. I think that if you're a serial killer, you should qualify for sort of a modified dangerous offender where you can never get out. To me, that's common sense. If you're killing people compulsively, you're the worst type of criminal.
Yeah, ironically, that is the most dangerous of offender. I mean, really, I hate to say it. Now, continue with a couple more cases that you found very, very unique and probably bolstered some of the ideas that you talk about in the last chapter and that you talk about throughout the book, sort of why is this? Why is it not known? Why is this information really kind of hard to find, really?
It's a question I'm asked a lot, and I don't know what the system's motive is. It just sort of exists, and so I only can really hazard guesses to you. I mean, we could say that it's, in Canada that we don't sensationalize things like they do in the United States or maybe to a lesser extent in the United Kingdom. That's kind of the positive way of looking at it. But I think that there might be this sort of idea as, Canada as the peaceful counterpart of America, and we don't want to own up to our problems with these type of offenders. Yeah. And so I think even in the reactions of a lot of just everyday Canadians I talk to, they don't want to know. And I think if your everyday Canadian is like that, then there's no reason to think that people in higher position of authorities would really be much different. It could be a cultural thing. And then, you can justify laws like that make it really hard for journalists to get access to information about these cases. I mean, we don't even have pictures of these people in court. I don't know what that's about. Why we can't have a picture of Robert Pickton in court? Why we have to just have a drawing of them? I'm not sure what the purpose of that is. But I don't know. Maybe it's a cultural thing.
Well, I think that what we have is a mythology going on. That two things going on, and being Canadian, I've heard this many times that America's violent, and we're not. We're not as violent as them. So we don't want to own up to our own violence, and that we have the same. We don't have the same per capita murder rates, but we do have. Again, we have many cases of incredible murder and incredible savagery, so we're not alone in that. But the thing is that what I think happens in America is that it's not of owning up. Is that the film industry and the documentary industry and the newspaper industry and the paper industry is American, and they're not going to shy away from history, current events, or a good story because they're journalists. And here, somehow we've lost our way. CBC has some kind of cockeyed notion of bias and telling Canadian stories. Look, if it's historic, and Bernardo and Homolka trial was historic, for what you could learn from it. I mean, incredible missteps and bungles and chicanery and injustice. Incredible for Canada to not talk about this and not say endlessly, but to discuss the aspects, not the gore. People say, well, we don't want to discuss the gore, the gory aspects. The goriest aspects of that case were the trial and the injustice and Karla Homolka being deemed a battered woman and the chicanery that was from there. And one of the authors, Williams, who tried to just tell the truth, really they tried to railroad the guy, not get the guy published. Yeah. It's incredible. And what we could have learned from the Pickton case, if anybody bothered to read the book, is amazing, but we don't. So I think there's something inherently lazy about our journalists, because they don't demand at the courts. There's transparency. There's no such thing. But at least we're not deriving enough information from trials. We're not learning anything from trials where the police bungled, missed opportunities, the judiciary acted totally improper. We have all kinds of stories like that, and there's not hundreds, but some of the Pickton, Bernardo Homolka, the Clifford Olson, those are stories that need to be told. And like your book with these 60 serial killers, incredible tales that hopefully Canadians will read, but I'm sure Americans, because they're just interested in great stories, will be interested in this book as well. That it's just incredible murders, all kinds of motivations, but it's a phenomenon. We've seen movies in the last few years. There's so many serial killer series and movies, so it is a subject that people are interested in, the criminal mind. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's so ubiquitous in our media and our culture. Yet at the same time, there's been studies showing that the serial murder rates are actually declined.
Yeah, but I think that we still see an escalation of barbarity. You know, we've had all kinds of cases. The guy that was torturing his roommate and wheeled him into the hospital at about 80 pounds, you know. The guy went from 240 to 80 pounds. So we're still getting these bizarre cases. And again, that was a high-profile case, but there are cases that most people don't hear about. They're just not aware of. They just miss. Maybe because they're not looking, or maybe because also the cases in Canada stretch on for 5, 6, 7 years sometimes. So it's hard to have a collective memory of what went on when you're talking about a 7-year span. So in America, a lot of cases are with. Pardon me?
That reminds me, when you're saying that, there was a guy who murdered. He was charged with murdering 2 prostitutes in. No, actually, I think they were strippers in Niagara Falls in 2006, and he still hasn't had his day in court. The guy's name was Michael Durant, and I keep waiting for news. You know, did he just fall off the radar? And then I looked into it, and no, just for some reason he's still not gone to trial. I mean, this was 6 years ago. But what if he's innocent? He just spent 6 years locked up waiting trial.
Mm-hmm. Well, and sorry, go ahead.
No, I was done.
And, the other thing is, too, we saw so much fanfare over the Luca Magnotta case, incredible amount of stuff online, and dominating the news stories probably worldwide to a great extent for a week or 2 or 3 weeks. And now that the trial will be 2.5 years, we won't hear anything till the preliminary. Then we won't hear anything about the preliminary because of our process. So we won't hear anything about that case for a good couple of years, if not 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, definitely. The only case that really moved along quickly was Russell Williams, and that's just because he confessed and he just wanted to get it over and done with. But yeah, the minute they start pleading not guilty or there's any sort of complication, that's you're definitely right. It enters that long period. But what amazes me with Magnotta is the amount of international attention that he gets, because he puts it on the internet. He does everything he's supposed to meet the qualifications of depraved murderer. So he commits acts of necrophilia. He tries to he may have cannibalized the guy, or at least tries to show us. He puts him with a kitten. He dismembers him. All these different things to do that, and it works. It goes global. It becomes a viral thing. That, the Canadian cannibal, the Canadian psycho, and then at the same time you've got something like the Highway of Tears going on in British Columbia, where between 1969 to present, I think Amnesty International has estimated something like 35 plus women have disappeared along the stretch of highway in British Columbia, but because the details aren't released, and there's no story angle like cannibalism or necrophilia, nobody really knows about it, and so none of the cases get solved, and there's probably been multiple serial killers stalking that stretch of highway. The victims are mostly Aboriginal and poor, and there's no news angle, so it never gets resolved.
Yeah, I think the Colonel Williams, and your book includes the Colonel Williams case. What I found interesting about the Colonel Williams case is that one of the victims was bound and gagged, hogtied, and of course, again, a really great example. And I'm not beating up on police at all, because police solve murders at a really high rate here at Murder Capital of Canada, Winnipeg, but they solve murders, complex murders. They try as hard as they can. It's not an easy job. It's one of the hardest jobs on earth, that's for sure. So definitely homicide cop. But there is some bungling, and there are cases of bungling. And with that, they thought that the victim, might have tied herself up and faked it. So that was
in one of the sexual assaults. Yeah. That's unfortunately, I think that's just a insensitivity of some police who do not work in sex crimes, with kind of first respondents type thing. And I believe that was the initial impression that they got. I'm not sure if the actual sex crimes investigators came away with that impression.
No, but that was the first initial. But what I'm saying is that it's a good example of just the inexperience. That's all. And that's I don't blame you. You're right. It's exactly what that is. Inexperience starts getting them suspicious of absolutely the wrong people. What did you find? Because I'm just interested what you thought about Russell Williams, the Colonel. I've done a program about BTK, and the trophy taking that he did was very similar to BTK. What did you find about? What was your take on Russell Williams, the Colonel? Very fascinating case.
I think that you made the right connection there. Whenever I compare Russell Williams to a serial killer, another serial killer, I usually go to BTK, sometimes Jerry Brudos, because of the whole the cross-dressing angle and the idea of invading someone else's space. I think that's something that both of those guys share, is that Williams wasn't so much turned on by the idea that he was dressed as a woman in that kind of abstract sense. He was more turned on by the idea that he was invading the personal clothing of his victims, and maybe thinking of what it would be like to be them coming home and finding that someone had been in their room, and by putting on their clothing, sort of psychologically making that connection to them. They're both, and interestingly, they're both military. BTK, I think, was also in the Air Force, wasn't he?
BTK was a reverend. I don't know if he did a stint in the military, but he was a sex offender, and then he was a practicing reverend. So that was BTK. But
he was in the Air Force. I'm pretty sure of it.
He could have been for sure.
I think
both these guys. Go ahead.
I think that the two of them almost look at as like a military operation, a special ops, like they're in their own fantasy, where there's some kind of super cool commando who infiltrates an enemy stronghold and sneaks around and perfectly controls the situation. It's almost like part of this. like kind of commando fantasy that they combine with their sex offender status, sex offender proclivities, and it's that would be the main comparison that I draw between the two, is this sort of this fantasy, this illusion of being on a mission, like BTK would call his victims hits, or the ones that he didn't kill, they would be potential hits. They put it in this sort of pseudo military language, and so I think that influences their fantasy and their thought process.
Well, absolutely, and the thing is too, the colonel, and then you have a reverend. You have the Ted Bundy working at a suicide hotline, and his friend is true crime super author Anne Rule. It's interesting. And people say, I couldn't tell. I mean, I don't know what they're looking for exactly, but there's a lot of people, a lot of military guys. Burl Bear has been on the program with Body Count. Serial killer there was in the military. A lot of guys are. Next week, Anthony Sowell. He was really good soldier. He enlisted, but he was in trouble before, and it's certainly absolutely in trouble after. But the military is a lot of these guys are pretty effective military people. So.
Yeah, they a lot of them will gravitate towards positions where they have authority or power. Like there's been a number of police officers after BTK left the military. His job was actually as a compliance officer, which is basically someone who goes around finding people because their lawns aren't cut to the right. The grass isn't cut to the right of length, or he catches their dogs and puts their dogs to sleep, kind of thing. Yeah, a lot of them gravitate towards any places where they can have some measure of control. I think in the case of Williams, though, it was more that he was trying, and this is just my guess, that he was trying to stave off these deep-seated desires and deviant fantasies that he'd had all his life. And I think he became sort of a workaholic to try and compensate for that. And then he gets into middle age. He's sort of reached about as high as he can go. I mean, he's base commander of Canada's most important Air Force base. He's getting kind of near the end of his sex life. I mean, not the complete end, but he's starting to think about it more. Apparently, he hadn't had sex with his wife for 2 years before the crimes. So I think he was a guy who always had this sort of deviant fantasy side and had done everything he could to stave it off. And he got to this one point in his mid-40s, and he looks around, and there's nowhere left to go. There's no other avenues to pursue. And at that point, he's hit with a crisis, and he just gives into it. That would be my way of analyzing that case. But I mean, you're talking about a certain trigger and that. But the only issue, that sounds like a lot more reasonable than what I read in Maclean's and some Canadian journalists, editorialized about Colonel Russell Williams. And I think that they should read some books about serial killers, because I know what you're saying, that that's probably, I mean, obviously he wasn't killing when he was 20 or 30 or 25, and he had to have concentrated on his studies. But from the book I read from David Gibb, I believe his name was, is that he just was an oddball all the throughout his life anyway, a loner, sort of a guy that just really was awkward, and so I think these sexual fantasies, he acted upon them, and he escalated very, very quickly. But you very well may be right. The only problem I have is trying to, because he becomes a colonel, or because somebody becomes something of some importance, that somehow or other they must have had some kind of, twist to their character. They still could have been a great military officer, and they still could have been, like you say, had these deviant, murderous fantasies well early, and all it was obviously he suppressed them. And the way to suppress them, the only way to suppress them, would be keep busy. And certainly that's what he was, a very busy person. So, Yeah, they compartmentalize, especially when we're talking about organized serial killers like Bundy, like BTK, like Russell Williams. They have sort of like their normal life, the kind of life that you and I would have, where they have their relationship and they have their job, and then there's the secret life that they have too. And I think that in the case of Williams, he just managed to focus enough on that first normal life long enough. He was able to use that to get him through, and it worked until his mid-40s, and then he got bored with it or frustrated with it, and when that collapsed, the deviant side that he'd been suppressing with the normal life, that kind of eclipsed it, and that would explain the rapid acceleration.
And the thing is, though, we really don't know the absolute truth, because of the very interesting phenomena is that just because he confessed, and just because he didn't, say, I plead not guilty, and drag the judicial system through the muck. Well, actually, he would have dragged his family and the military. I think he was very conscious of what he had done to the military, and maybe what would happen to his wife and family. So he was not a stupid man, and so even though his narcissism was very strong with these guys, he thought he was untouchable. That's why he made the big grand errors that he did do. The thing is, I think that there's some other things going on there that he realized that the military was not going to have, where he would plead not guilty and they would drag this out for a couple of years. And so there's another part of I think every serial killer, as you can attest to, is different, even though it does share some characteristic.
Certainly. Very, very good point. Often I'm asked when I come on these sorts of programs, they'll say, so tell me, what do these guys all have in common? And usually I have to pull out an answer about, that typically they have a strong fantasy life that, where power and violence fuse with sexuality. But it's not true of all of them. It may be true with most of them, but it's simply not true of everyone who commits serial murders. So sometimes I'm tempted to answer, and by no means facetiously, but just to answer, well, they kill people, then they stop, and then they kill people. That's really what they have in common. If you want to take all serial killers and put them into a box, that's the one thing they have in common.
Yeah, and then, you're still, what you're getting now is people trying to play catch up, and as a sophisticated true crime audience that listens to this program and reads true crime books by the major true crime authors like yourself and other people, these people know that it just because this idea that all serial killers have tortured animals when they're young. This other idea, and again, it's a Canadian idea, and I curse the development of this, is that now that your boss can be psychopathic. So we take the word psychopathic and we take the teeth right out of it, because apparently your boss can be, and the guy, your neighbor, and your husband, and you can be. And so it takes any kind of magnitude or any kind of importance out of the term psychopathic killer. And like you were talking before, there's a huge difference between Vincent Lee and Sidney Tierhus or Luca Magnotta or other serial killers or any of these other serial killers in Canada, because they're far more scary than the person that did not have an intent to kill. Certainly I can admit to that. And whether they can respond to medication or not, it's not. The other person is a personification of evil. That's what these serial killers are. Clifford Olsons and Bernardos and the Picktons and the Tierhuses and Twitchells. These people are just evil. That's the scary part. They look, and as we're seeing with Luca Magnotta and Twitchell and some of these other people, sometimes they look pretty handsome, pretty normal, pretty boy next door, and that's disarming for people,
Yeah, but I mean, it's kind of part of. If we're getting back to serial killers, because, I mean, Magnotta doesn't seem to have been one, at least he hasn't been linked to other murders. But if we get back to the idea of serial killers, I mean, if they were walking around with fangs dripping blood and red eyes, they wouldn't be a serial killer because they wouldn't have gotten away with their first murder. It's the very ability to wear that mask where people overlook you, which makes you successful as a serial murderer in the first place. So it's almost like a Darwinistic process. If you don't have the proper facade, you will be weeded out after your first murder.
Well, the thing is, like I say, I don't think that always that there is there's all kinds of people that are suspected of other murders, and I think that's where it ends. And we know that, in American law, there's some constraints to continually questioning somebody after they are convicted. You still have to have a reasonable amount of evidence, not just the assumption that this guy must have killed before. I spoke to the arresting lead homicide detective, and he said, well, it's one thing to say it, and certainly we entertain the thought, but it's another thing to prove it. And unless he's going to confess, where are you getting the information? If there's no body, then what do you do? And we have to think that there are certainly serial killers that were more than capable of disposing of bodies. We talk about Jeffrey Dahmer and Gacy. There were certainly others that, whether they were throwing them in rivers or burying them successfully or burning them in the back, there's a lot of people that least attempted to dispose of their victims completely. So,
well, then how many guys like David Parker Ray? Probably, I consider him to be the sickest serial killer that I'm aware of. I'm sure your listeners are familiar with him. They still haven't found any bodies from him, but they just have videotape evidence showing that he committed at least one murder, and then evidence of testimony of his colleagues saying, he said he killed about 60 people. But he was so good at hiding bodies that they still haven't found any of them. It was really only the fact that one of his victims escaped that the world even got to know about him, because he was into his 60s when this was happening. So the question I then ask is, what about guys like David Parker Ray where the victim doesn't escape? The serial killers who are that competent and we just never know they exist. We just have a bunch of missing people, or people who are the missing, as a term that's been coined lately, where they're not even reported missing in the first place. Yeah,
well, that's it. And I mean, these serial killers are notorious for choosing the marginalized in society, as I put in my book as well. It's not only the street prostitutes, again, the people that are missed the least, but the homosexuals traveling on buses, and the homosexual prostitutes. So it's the homeless, the alcoholics, the people that have been separated from their families and overworked and somewhat skeptical police as well. So a lot of people aren't even reported. So where have they gone, and what has been their fate? Certainly.
And I do actually have a chapter on the book on that, about high-risk victims, and give examples of offenders that have targeted them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good that you've done that as well with this, rather than just another endless report of this victim and that victim. There has to be some discussion. There has to be something learned from this, and I'm sure that you have come to some conclusions after all of this as well. What would you think is your most profound conclusion after doing all this, this disturbing research for this book?
I think that my most profound conclusion is that we have to analyze these people on many more levels than we're actually doing. A lot of the times they're analyzed criminologically or psychologically, but I think that we also have to take a look at how they react and to their society, and how they're influenced by the society around them. So I think that we need to look at them as sociological entities more too, which the Canadian author Elliot Layton did. I mean, it's very easy to describe someone as a medical construct, that this part of their brain doesn't work, or they are a borderline personality, or they are a visionary type serial killer, and the tendency is to put them in these kind of boxes because it helps sell textbooks, Mm-hmm. But at the end of the journey, I realized that these boxes, though they have some use, in reality, what we're looking at is we are just like any other sector of humankind. We're looking at people who are highly individual. They just happen to share the same hobby of killing people. But if you have people that all participate in gymnastics or making model airplanes, I mean, they're going to share some things in common. There's going to be overlaps, but they're still going to be vastly different. So in order to understand a serial killer, you don't do it by taking him and putting him into one of several frameworks. I think you have to almost dissect him and look at his individual components and understand, or her, his or her. You have to understand him as an individual, and then once we get to doing that, maybe we'll have some insight where boxes will kind of appear to us, rather than forcing them into organized or disorganized or visionary, missionary, hedonist, power control, these kind of typologies.
Yeah, those descriptions, like you say, have some value, but beyond just rudimentary, just very elementary.
Yeah.
The person that I spoke with for a year was more than willing to talk to journalists, and lots of journalists refused because they didn't want to be. I think they just didn't want to be involved in the case, and it was very gruesome. And this guy was like celebrity obsessed. This character, but the thing is that this person now still wants to talk. There's been he had fanfare for 8 years in the media. Sometimes he would contact the media, and they would print a story about this flesh-eating disease and that he's innocent. And this is before the trial, so he was used to getting that type of attention. Now, if they sent trained people from the OPP and the RCMP who were trained by FBI criminal profilers and students of criminology, then get a hands-on on the worst offenders that they would be dealing with and to be studying. And I really think that the serious crime is where Canada fails to recognize the patterns of the rapists and the people that will escalate in their behavior. So the very violent are sometimes considered not so violent, or in the Vincent Lee case, they're predicting a 1% chance of reoffending. It's ridiculous, some kind of odds of reoffending.
Yeah. How do you determine that? Like, honestly, it sounds rather arbitrary to me.
Sounds pretty confident with the 1%.
Yeah, I mean, still, I don't see how they arrive at that. It's like almost like they said, well, what's the lowest number we can put? Obviously they must believe he's not in danger. They must believe it. And I think that as long as he stays on the pills, he probably isn't. But we all know that there are people who are mentally ill that, because of their mental illness, at some point stop taking the medication.
But you've got to admit, of all the schizophrenics, all the people suffering from schizophrenia, and certainly there's been some insane killers, but they're very, very rare. Even in Canada, where insanity is an easier thing, like we saw that, I don't know if his name's Turcotte, the doctor that stabbed his kids to death. Well, it's a joke that guy's temporarily insane, right? He was depressed, so he stabbed his kids to death. I don't buy it. And American courts won't buy it, and most courts will not buy that stretching of the definition of insanity. Vincent Lee, yes, definitely insane. There was another case in Winnipeg where this was a cannibal. He did not evade capture, so by definition, his bizarre behavior, he didn't try to hide the fact, so that was the definition of insanity. But it's very rare for somebody to be designated as insane and then not culpable or not responsible for the murders. But we routinely, which is the scary part, and we've spoken about it, is they routinely will let out double murderers or, again, murdered reduced to manslaughter. We don't know the details by the time it gets to the paper, by the time it survives a voir dire or the preliminary, what information is withheld from the judge, what information is withheld from the public about the true nature of these people. So I think what's happening is that we need to understand as much, especially when the person's willing to talk. Clifford Olson was willing to talk. Even though he's a disgusting human being, he was willing to talk. So you have to get, first off, those criminals, those serial killers, those people, those rapists that are willing to talk, and listen to them. number one, to learn. I mean, instead of listening to psychiatric evaluations from short interviews with people who may not be maybe disingenuous. So I think when you really have somebody who wants to talk endlessly, speak, converse, and try to learn something from these serial killers that can be some value when we're looking at other people that may be getting into this kind of a behavior and becoming potential serial killers, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a point that I'd like to bring up, too. I mean, we've been doing a lot of bashing of the Canadian legal system, and I do definitely agree with the Americans having consecutive sentences. I think that's a very smart way to go about it. But I do find that sometimes that in the United States, they'll go too far to the other extreme, where you'll have a serial killer like Vince Lee, who is psychotic. And I'm thinking specifically of Richard Trenton Chase, the vampire of Sacramento.
Yeah.
And here's a guy, he believed that because the soap on his soap dish was gooey, that it meant that there were UFOs turning his blood into dust, and so therefore he had to drink blood to replenish his supply. So that's exactly what he did. He was completely schizophrenic, and he went out just in his own neighborhood, going into homes and killing people and cannibalizing them and drinking their blood, and he's given the death penalty. And I think that's going to the other extreme. It's like you're taking a guy who is clearly mentally ill and committing his crimes motivated by a complete unwilling misunderstanding of reality. And this is a person that should probably be confined to a psychiatric institute for the rest of their life, yes. But to execute them, it's too far in the other direction for me. So I'd like to find a happy medium between the two.
Well, I don't believe in the death penalty because I don't believe in making even one error where someone's dead, and they make too many errors. Courts make errors here. We have all these checks and balances and appeals, but you know what? Mistakes are made. And I think that if you can spend the rest of your life in prison, I think that has to be enough punishment. A cage all by yourself has to be enough punishment. So I don't believe in that. So I do agree with you. And once they have even sometimes DNA evidence or a confession that's been retracted, they still sometimes are very, very hesitant to let that person out. So it's almost the opposite of Canada. We're looking for excuses. Our latest serial killer in Winnipeg, they don't have much to talk about, so they're talking about his harsh upbringing already. I'm going, wow. It is a different animal than America. I think the media there and the people there have seen that rehabilitation really doesn't work with these people, and that's why they keep seeing endless, vicious, senseless, random murder there. And hopefully we don't have to have an epidemic of that before we start changing things. Because, as you know, it's when you get emotional and not very logical and reasonable, then you start making laws that hurt all kinds of people and go the other way. So, yeah, I think there has to be a happy medium, absolutely, with insane. I think if you're the definition in a lot of American states is that you're insane but guilty. So they really don't. I think that the vampire killer that you were talking about, Chase, I think that was the case. That no matter what, that's what they didn't care. Or there are lots of states where it doesn't matter if you're insane. They'll clearly say, yeah, insane, but still doesn't matter. So,
but you drank blood, and that's evil, so you deserve to die. And a lot of people were saying that about Vince Lee. I remember there was being calls, if there's one person who has to die, it's this guy, because they're looking at, he cut his head off and 8 parts of his face. They're looking at the specifics, the details of the crime, and they're not looking at the motivation or what sparked it. That really determines the core of a person's character. And in the case of this man, he deserved to die less than people who've committed far less barbarous murderers, because he was extremely psychotic at the time that he did it. And although I do agree with you, I don't support the death penalty either, and not necessarily just because of the whole idea of executing an innocent person, which is terrible, but I also think that it gives some of these people an escape. There's lots of serial killers who I've read about, and I can't name them off the top of my head, but it comes up all the time. They are perfectly fine with dying. They'd rather do that than spend their life in a cage, which is what Bernardo has to do here. You know, he's basically locked in a closet for the rest of his life. And to me, you're taking away their control and you're making it last over a period of time, whereas if you're executing them, you're bringing it to an end for them.
But you do hear that call in Canada as well, and I think what it is just it's an emotional response to the barbarity of the crime itself, and so they it's a knee-jerk reaction, and the death penalty is being, lots of states are dropping it. So because it takes maybe 15 years or 17 years to actually execute somebody, and then the appeal process is so expensive that they really can't afford to do it. So there's a confluence of things going on, 2 or 3 things going on that are making the death penalty less appealing. So, but I do agree though that, and I think that the Americans have done a good job. The FBI were the first people with, like I said, Robert K. Ressler and John Douglas. They went in and interviewed 36 of the worst serial killers, and that's how they create criminal profiling. I think it's time to not just take a look at that criminal profiling and just let it sit. I think it's time to expound upon that, because there are these unique characteristics, and I think they can develop a bigger sort of a description instead of such a narrow description of what a serial killer is. And I think there's overlapping, and again, the labels don't do much. But I think the idea that we have to be able to learn something by speaking with these people, because it's such an aberration. You can't approach logic with these people. They're not like regular folks. It's not that we all have this potential in us to be like these people. There's no way. And you've done the research. These people are so far away from the regular Joe, you and I, that's why it's fascinating.
There is a logic, just not our logic.
Yeah.
When you're able to get into their heads, and I have been able to get there, and suddenly you can see their point of view, but it means taking a lot of the parts about yourself, a lot of your ideas, a lot of your morality and the things that repel you, and you just remove them. And then you put yourself through that person's life situation. And I have been able to get inside their heads, and I can see the logic of why they're doing what they're doing, even if it's still, ultimately, I find it morally reprehensible. Even the insane ones, like Vince Lee, he saw the guy on the bus as a demon that had to be killed, and he had to eat parts of him to stop him from regenerating. Now, that's completely ridiculous if you're perceiving reality as it is, but if you're perceiving reality as he is, which he believes is reality, then logically it does make sense that he would do what he did.
Well, the only thing I'm really worried about is that I'm not sure that we have any experience, and there is any really good examples of taking somebody that was capable of what Vincent Lee was capable of doing in terms of going that far into his, altered reality, and then assuring the public, especially the poor mother of the victim, to say, listen, we're absolutely confident from our experience from the last time we had a Vincent Lee that this medication is absolutely foolproof. Nothing can happen. He could never get a resistance to it. He can't be playing us because we're so clever. I just hate to see this thing backfire. And you know what? I'd hate to see it work. Because you know what will happen when Vincent Lee is cured? There's going to be a lot of people not going into the insane asylum for very long. And we already have people that are claiming, or at least the psychiatric institution is saying, this person shouldn't be even in here. This person doesn't belong here. There's nothing wrong with them. So that's what I just think, that you look at the battered women syndrome, which is first in the U.S. and then in I cases that I can agree with in Canada, where you say, yes, the battered woman, she killed her husband or her boyfriend because of, and then you look in a short period of time at Karla Homolka as a battered woman, never having lived with, so you can see my point anyway, that, once the lawyers get it and twist it, we can have an altered state of reality again on what that law was intended to do, what it really should apply to, and then Karla Homolka's, somehow rehabilitated, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I guess there's always going to be some slip in the system, unfortunately, but we can always strive to make it better.
Absolutely. Well, with books like yourself, we can get an idea of what's gone on in history in terms of serial killers in the Canada. Not really well known for serial killers, but after this, some really fascinating, unique, and as we said before, Canada really can compete sometimes. So your book is Cold North Killers, Canadian Serial Murder, and Lee Mellor. So thank you very much, Lee, for a great interview and a great book, and I wish you all the best of luck with this, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks. It was less like an interview and more like a conversation, and I consider that a success. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, where is this available? Obviously, it's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, chapters in Canada. And do you have a website that people can go to as well?
Yeah, but you can't purchase my book through it. I would just go to, your Amazon, Barnes & Noble, chapters. If you get in Canada, you'll probably find it on the bookshelves of Chapters and Indigo. In the States, I'm not sure because I haven't been to bookstores looking. You may get lucky, but I'd say Amazon's a pretty safe bet.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, is it in ebook form as of yet, or is that soon to come, or is there any? It's already out.
Ebook.
Oh,
yeah,
great!
It is in ebook form.
Oh, great. And are you on Facebook? And are you interested in followers on Facebook? So I always tell people look them up on Facebook.
Sure, yeah.
Or follow them on Facebook.
Yeah, go for it.
Absolutely.
Look for Cold North Killers. It has a page. I'm actually working on right now a follow-up book called Rampage, which is about mass murderers and spree killers in Canada. And I've got a page for that coming soon, so I'll be talking about that on the Cold North Killers page. So yeah, Facebook, Cold North Killers, and anytime there's an update involving crimes or serial killers in Canada, I usually I post an update.
Right on. Well, very good, Lee. Thank you very much for coming on the program, and definitely get a hold of me when your next project, Rampage, is getting close or when it's going to be released, and we'll have you back on. We'll have another good interview and talk about that.
Okay, can't wait.
Okay, thank you very much, Lee. Have a good night.
You too, Dan. Bye.
Thank you. Good night.